Welcome. Today we're asking, how can the U.S. defend the 2020 election against Russian interference? David Shimer will discuss this and his latest book, Rigged, with Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. David Shimer is currently a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, an associate fellow at Yale University, and a Marshall Scholar at the University of Oxford. His reporting and analysis have appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, and Foreign Affairs. His latest book is called Rigged: America, Russia, and 100 Years of Covert Electoral Interference. We highly recommend you pick up your own copy, and our friends at RJ Julia Bookstore are offering a special signed edition for today's attendees, so we'll add that link into the chat. And now let's just get started. I'm pleased to turn it over to Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, David, and welcome to State of the World today. I can't think of a more timely topic that's on all of our minds as we are only 41 days away from our election. So I want to jump right in, David, and I want to ask you, can you tell us about your book, Rigged? What is your book about, and why did you write it?
Totally, and thank you again very much for being here, and to all of the attendees for virtually zooming in. I would say that I wrote my book, Rigged, because I was alarmed, frankly, after the 2016 election, when so many commentators, so many politicians described Russia's interference in the 2016 election as somehow unprecedented or entirely new. And the problem with that is when something's treated as unprecedented, that suggests there's no history behind it. It suggests there's no broader way to understand an issue, to really get at the heart of an issue and to figure out how to deal with it and how to defend against it. And so I seek to correct that dangerous myth in my book, Rigged. I restore history in my book to the subject of covert electoral interference. I show how the Soviet Union and the United States interfered in elections all over the world during the Cold War. I show how Russia is again interfering in elections all over the world today. And only then do I examine and get at the heart at what happened in 2016 and what's happened since then with the Trump administration. And I posit, or would argue, that in doing so, 2016 takes an entirely new shape. What Russia achieved comes into much fuller view, and it's possible to respond to this threat in a much more comprehensive and effective manner by, instead of just treating every piece of news as so alarming and so novel, instead really try to understand, where have we been, where are we now, and where are we going? And that's what I try to do in my book.
Thank you, David. Can you walk us through and outline for us some of the forms of Russian electoral interference? What forms have they taken over the years, and what have been some of the goals of Russia in interfering and meddling in our elections?
Sure. So covert electoral interference, whether in 1920 or 2020, can only take one of two forms. You can either seek to change ballots directly, either by stuffing ballot boxes or hacking into and manipulating voting systems, or you can seek to manipulate the opinions of voters, their minds, with propaganda, whether it be by spreading leaflets and pamphlets or by spreading tweets and hacked emails. So in terms of Russia's methods, those modes of interference have remained the same. In 1945, 6, and 7, for instance, the Soviet Union corrupted elections across Eastern Europe by spreading massive amounts of propaganda and by manipulating voting systems. In 2016 in America, likewise, Russia spread massive amounts of propaganda across social media and with stolen emails, and it systemically penetrated our voting systems, giving it access to millions of Americans' voting information and the potential, according to John Brennan in the interview I did with him for my book, to actually change the ballots of U.S. citizens. In terms of Russia's objectives, in the 20th century, the Soviet objective was to support leftist candidates, to spread an ideology, to support communist officials at the ballot box. Vladimir Putin, however, has freed himself of those ideological constraints. He sees himself locked in a power struggle, not an ideological struggle with the West. And so he will support far-right candidates, far-left candidates. He doesn't care so long as they're authoritarian-minded and disruptive and will degrade and corrupt their democracies from within. And it's very important to understand that Russia is executing that strategy on a global basis. They are interfering in elections all over the world. I interviewed, for example, the president of Montenegro, whom Russian intelligence tried to assassinate, as well as the former president of Colombia, Colombia who told me about how he received warnings of Russian interference in his country. So this is happening all over the world, and it's on us, or it should be on us as the United States, to forge a global strategy for defending against this threat and therefore defending the democratic model.
Can we talk a little bit about the tactics that Russia has used and how they've sort of changed over the years in the advancements, as advancements in technology have happened, in social media? How has Russia's playbook changed, or has it?
So I would actually argue that much of Russia's playbook has remained the same. That's kind of one of the core things that I think history reveals. Russia's always done things like seek to inflame tensions that already exist, seek to inflame racial division, religious division, seek to support one candidate over another, seek to divide democracies from within, seek to infect information systems, seek to affect voting systems. That is what Russia did in the 20th century. It's what Russia's doing in the 21st. You're right, however, that the internet has cause for evolution. And in that sense, what it's done is it's allowed Russia to do a few new things. One, it's allowed Russia to penetrate the United States at scale. As I detail in my book, the Soviet Union tried to interfere in America's elections throughout the Cold War through very familiar tactics, but those operations were really duds. They were never really able to get at the American electorate on a broad basis. The internet has changed that. Now they can. Second, Russia is able to now turbocharge its pre-existing tactics across social media and the web. Instead of just finding and releasing one physical document, they could steal and release 50,000 digital emails. Instead of just spreading one line of messaging with pamphlets, they could spread many lines of messaging targeting specific groups of people across social media. And instead of just stuffing ballot boxes in a few locations, they could target election systems across our country through hackers based thousands of miles away. So these ideas are very old, but the reach and penetrability of the internet has enabled Russia to reinvest and double down on this weapon in a very broad-reaching way.
What was it about Russia's 2016 operation that was new? Was it a continuation of the past? So, and there's an audience question about, has Russia always been acutely aware of sort of the racial divides that exist in the US, and have they been particularly successful in trying to exploit those?
So I think that absolutely they have. I was struck. I spent about half a day interviewing a former KGB general for my book. And what he said to me was that the greatest vulnerability of the United States from the KGB's perspective was our diversity, particularly our racial diversity, because from the Soviet perspective, that diversity presents an opportunity to sow division, to sow chaos, to take advantage of the failures or shortcomings in systemic racism in our own society and pour gasoline on it in order to do two things, both to make America more dysfunctional at home and also to undermine America's image in the eyes of the world. And there are examples in my book of the Soviet Union staging hate crimes or otherwise sowing racial division in the United States throughout the Cold War in order to achieve those objectives. It's unsurprising, or should be, that in 2016 and since, Russia's continued to try to sow racial division in the United States, building, of course, on divisions and shortcomings that already exist, because the Russian tradition here is to take advantage of vulnerabilities that it didn't create, but that it can exploit. And in terms of our own elections and what was new, the Soviet Union interfered in the 1960 and 68 election in order to undermine Richard Nixon, a Republican. They interfered in the 76 and 84 election to undermine Ronald Reagan, a Republican. What mattered about those operations was their intent, not their scope, because they were limited in what they were actually able to achieve. Whereas in 2016, Russia was able to help a Republican, which now aligns with its objectives, but to do so in a sprawling way, to reach more than 100 million Americans across social media, to steal and release sensitive emails, and to penetrate our infrastructure. So what's new about that is that they were able to, again, manipulate our election at scale, that they were able to overtake our information environment, that they were able to meld two types of interference at once, hacking into voting systems and spreading propaganda, doing both of those things at the same time, and that they were able to do so without really suffering meaningful consequences from the perspective of what the United States decided to respond to its operation with.
So in your research for your book, did you find any evidence, or is there anyone out there who is willing to say that Russia was successful in actually changing ballots?
So Harry Reid told me that he believes that Russia did alter actual ballots in order to swing the election to Donald Trump. However, it is extremely important to note that there is no evidence that I've seen that supports that claim, nor did he say that he possessed direct evidence supporting that claim other than just what Russia's capabilities he'd been told were. Susan Rice, Jay Johnson, Dennis McDonough, all very senior officials in the Obama administration told me they saw no evidence that actual election systems were affected by the Russians. So I don't think we should overstate at all the likelihood of that happening. I think it's very close to zero in terms of the evidence that was apparent to Obama administration officials. What mattered about Russia's access to our voting systems was that it froze the Obama administration, or it captivated the Obama administration, because in the summer and fall of 2016, President Obama knew that Russia had stolen and released sensitive emails, but he also knew that Russia was systemically targeting our voting systems. And so the imperative in the Obama team became making sure that Russia either didn't escalate toward disrupting our voting process, or if they did, that we were prepared for it. And so on Election Day itself, as I reveal in Rigged, the White House and DHS were actually running secret crisis teams bracing for a Russian cyber attack against our election infrastructure. And by the time the election came, no such attack emerged, but Donald Trump won. And millions of Americans had been reached by propaganda propagated or spread by the Russians. So I think moving forward, what's important to keep in mind is that to defend an election is to defend against both of those lines of attack. It's to both defend against efforts to manipulate public opinion and also to defend against efforts to manipulate voting systems. To defend an election is to tackle both of those issues.
So let's look back for a second on the Obama administration's response to Russia's interference in our election in 2016. Do you think the response was effective, and how does that impact where we are today?
So I really try. The second part of my book really gets into that question. I interviewed 26 former advisors to President Obama and really tried to just put politics aside and get at the heart of what were the decisions that he and his core team made and why. And what I found, and the question I focused on, was the timing of when he retaliated against Russia for its operation, because his senior-most Russia advisors wanted him to hit Russia that summer to signal that he would tolerate no further interference in the election. However, another team of advisors, or another subset of advisors, thought that the risks of retaliating were too high, that if President Obama were to punish Russia, Russia could respond by escalating its operation towards sabotaging our actual voting process. And given that risk, as well as the potential exposure of our sources and methods, as well as the discord and doubt that Donald Trump was sowing and alleging that the election would be rigged, a calculation was made that there was a red line, so to speak, as one official put it to me, where as long as Russia didn't escalate from manipulating voters to affecting voting systems, retaliation could wait until after the election. And as I detail in my book, many former senior advisors to President Obama, in hindsight, wish that they had punished Russia sooner in order to deter its operation as it was ongoing, although at the time, they didn't have a full picture of Russia's operation across social media, and the emails perhaps seem less significant than they now seem looking back.
So let's talk about where we are today. What can we expect from Russia? We know that Josh Rogan published a report yesterday that talks about the highest levels of the Russian government being involved in the meddling. So what can we expect today? What can we expect on Election Day, David?
Sure, and that article said that Vladimir Putin probably was directing this operation, and if history's any guide, then there's no probably there. Electoral interference operations, when they're authorized, are authorized by the heads of government. They're sensitive, they're the stakes are high. I've never seen an operation to interfere in an election covertly that a president was just completely oblivious to, or completely in the dark on. That doesn't really stack up against this history. So I would drop the probably if we're trying to sort of see what's really going on here. And in terms of what Russia can do, we know that Russia is actively interfering in this election. That has been testified by the director of the FBI. That has been issued or announced by the U.S. intelligence community. So that is a baseline as to what's happening right now. We also know that Russia's objectives are to sow discord and to denigrate Vice President Biden, and therefore to help Donald Trump. And in terms of what they're actually doing, we've seen Facebook and Twitter announce a takedown of covert Russian accounts, which signals that there will be more to come there, because, these operations come into full view as time progresses. That's the nature of discovering covert operations or outing them. We've also seen Microsoft announce that Russian intelligence is targeting the personal information or emails of hundreds of US political figures. And if they were to acquire that information, they could presumably release it. So that is an ongoing threat. But perhaps at the top of my list, as I think about what to watch out for, is how Russia will seek to take advantage of the doubt sowed by the coronavirus in our country, as well as by Donald Trump, around the stability of this election, around its legitimacy, in order to undermine that legitimacy further and sow chaos and dysfunction. Because the Russian objective, above all, is to tear down and to tear apart American democracy. And so if you were to spread disinformation, for example, alleging that the election was rigged, or if you were to cause chaos at polling places or to sabotage voter databases to provide fodder for the president to say the election was rigged, to throw the outcome into further doubt, that aligns with Russia's objectives just as much as releasing emails. So I would be watching out for Russia both to seek to manipulate American voters between now and Election Day, but I would also watch out for Russia to seek to undermine the legitimacy of this election between Election Day and when the results of the election are known, whether by spreading more disinformation or by affecting our actual election systems.
So I'm going to ask a question from the audience. Does Russia feel they're succeeding in their attempts to meddle in the elections and sow discord in the United States?
So there's obviously limited information around what Russian officials think about operations that they deny exist, but we do know that intercepted communications that have been declassified by the US government show one employee of a Russian troll farm saying after the 2016 election, effectively, we raised our glasses and toasted to making America great again, which suggests that he believed that his unit or his team had altered the outcome of an American election. And I would argue that it's often impossible to actually know whether operations to influence voters matter or don't, or how much they matter. But what matters more from the perspective of policymaking, as you suggested, is whether they believe it matters. And I think that given the discord that has been sowed in America since the 2016 election, particularly around this issue, but also otherwise, how far and wide those emails spread, how many Americans were reached on social media, I see no reason why Vladimir Putin wouldn't see this as a successful form of attack, especially because he's paid almost no price for doing it, whether against America or against countries or democracies around the world, where I try to really get a broad sense of this strategy. So if I were Russia, I would see this for now as something well worth doing on an aggressive basis, and we'll see where it leads. But again, keep in mind his objectives aren't just to choose our leaders for us, it's to sabotage our democratic processes and undermine the viability of our democracy as a viable form of governance, which suits his interests at home and abroad and is an ongoing story where the stakes become very high in the coming weeks because there's so much doubt about whether our democratic processes are in fact viable as a result of how much dysfunction is being sowed, not only by the president, but also by this pandemic.
So there are some in this administration who have worked to sort of downplay the threat that Russia poses and sort of talked more about the influence that China and Iran might be having. Can you talk a little bit about the success of Russia's efforts versus as opposed to what China and Iran might be doing? Can you separate that out?
Sure. So there's no equivalency between what China is doing or known to be doing, which is just public messaging that is in favor of one candidate, as compared to what Russia did in 2016, which was launch a sweeping and systemic, as Robert Mueller put it, operation to influence millions of American voters and to systemically penetrate our election infrastructure. That one is just public messaging. The other is a very ambitious covert operation. And right now we know that Russia is again executing such an operation. I've seen no evidence to suggest that China or Iran is. They don't have the history of doing this. They don't really have the global reason to be doing it. But maybe they'll imitate Russia because Russia's operation in 2016 was outed in such a public way. And if they do decide to imitate Russia in terms of its tactics the last time around, we should be on guard for that and we should condemn it. But so far that hasn't happened. So right now, Russia is the actor that's interfering aggressively in this election. And so it is on us as the United States to respond to Russia's operation as a country rather than as one or another political party, because at the end of the day, this is an attack against our democracy and our ability to function as such.
Can you talk about some of the barriers that the U.S. intelligence community might be facing in their efforts to combat Russian election interference?
So to be candid, I think the biggest problem right now is that Russia is just spreading messages that are being generated domestically. where you've seen, for example, the president argue that mail-in voting is rife with fraud. Well, we've now seen DHS warn that Russia is amplifying messaging that mail-in voting is rife with fraud. We've seen Donald Trump say that his opponent has mental health issues, and now we've seen intelligence that Russia's amplifying those arguments as well. So the problem here is that 4 years ago, Russia was in many ways seeking to incorporate new arguments into pre-existing ones, whereas now Russia is just spreading messages that are being spread by the head of our government. So if you're talking about how to defend against those sorts of efforts as a baseline, the trouble here is that those messages are being spread by the person who should be the authoritative source of information about our intelligence services, about threats to our nation, who is the president. So I think that that is sort of first order problem in terms of a new impediment to addressing this threat. And then there are many others, such as the fact that social media companies are private organizations that the Congress is not regulated and that the US government can cooperate with, but by no means can or should be able to control. The same goes for reporters who report on hacked documents if those were to emerge. The freedom of the press is a cherished right in this country, as it should be. So if reporters decide to report on those documents aggressively, the US government, US intelligence services can't stop them from doing so, nor again should they be able to. So I think that there are information sharing that can happen. There is norms that can be established. But this is a threat, again, not just to our government, to our nation. It seeks to corrupt the way Americans communicate with and relate to one another. And to respond to such a threat requires the buy-in of our democracy. And unfortunately, we're just not there right now because this is viewed as such a partisan issue that if you agree is a problem, then you must be a Democrat. And if you don't, then you must be a Republican. And that makes us fertile ground for sabotage because we're so unable to just get our own act together to this very acute and ongoing threat.
So we have an audience question about Ukraine. Is Ukraine meddling in our election? Is it being used as a proxy by the Russians for another mode of interfering in our election? Is there a role that Ukraine is playing?
So I think we've seen Russia seek to use officials in Ukraine as a cutout or a third party for its interference operation. That's been documented by the U.S. government, but I have not seen. But in terms of Ukraine's actions on its own, there is no evidence that I've seen that Ukraine or the Ukrainian government is launching a covert operation in order to manipulate the U.S. election. That is not happening based on any facts that are available to the public domain. Again, we have to be mindful of efforts to divert attention because confusion makes us more vulnerable. So what are the facts? The facts are that Russia aggressively interfered in America's 2016 election, and the FBI director has testified publicly is again very actively interfering in this election. That's a fact. China, Iran, Ukraine, they might have preferences for what happens in this election, as many countries do, but none of them are seeking to execute so far an operation that resembles at all in its very nature, scope, scale, or reach what Russia's done or is seeking to do. So I think we need to, as you said, separate those two issues, but also watch out for whether Russia will seek to co-opt or use as agents lawmakers in the Ukrainian government to further its own operations to interfere in this election.
What do you think Russia's long-term objective is in promoting divisiveness? Is there an objective beyond power?
So there is an objective. It's not, and I worry, that's a great question. I worry that people, when they hear Russia seeking to sow discord, well, okay, but what is that really about? What's the end goal here? And the answer is that Russia is seeking to not just sow discord, they're seeking to sow discord as a means of corrupting democracies from within, from dividing democracies from each other and from the inside, and ultimately to transform democratic systems into corrupted authoritarian versions of themselves. And Russia believes that in doing so, it will make it so that America will be unable to lead a broader function at home. Other democracies that it corrupts will draw or be drawn into Russia's orbit and away from the international institutions that have traditionally underpinned American power in the world, and that the Russian people will see that the democratic model isn't flat fact, flawed, unenviable, corruptible, and penetrable. So this strategy for Russia is very appealing, very, very worth executing. And it's not just about discord. And it's not just, by the way, about Donald Trump. Russia started interfering in the 2016 election in 2014 before Trump announced. They had plans, as I reveal in my book, according to Jim Clapper and John Brennan, to continue interfering in the election had Hillary Clinton won, to sow that discord, to sow chaos. And again, because it's not just about Trump. Trump is a means to a still further end, which is to tear apart and tear down our democracy. And that is what Russia is doing not only in the United States, but in countries around the world in supporting figures or politicians who aren't in alignment with traditional small d democratic values in terms of how they lead and how they view their own mandate of leadership.
So in some of those other countries around the world in which Russia is exerting their influence, have any of those countries been successful in mounting a campaign against Russian interference?
So I think we've seen components of what a successful strategy would look like. We've seen countries in the Baltics, for example, run education initiatives around educating their citizens about disinformation and how to distinguish between facts and fiction, reliable information and unreliable information. We've seen in France, Russia-linked hackers steal and release emails belonging to Emmanuel Macron's campaign. But we then saw the French press, the French citizenry, and French politicians more or less all say, wait, we all just saw America get played by a similar form of attack. We don't want to get played too. And those emails had almost no effect or very little reach in terms of the actual election debate for reasons in part having to do with France's media culture, but also in terms of their willingness to resist this form of interference. And so I think for the United States, we should learn from those countries. We should be less gullible. We should be spreading fact-based information, investing in education. We should also be securing our infrastructure and amping up efforts to defend our social media information ecosystem, as well as to reduce the effectiveness of stolen documents if those were released, while also getting at the polarization in our own society that makes us so vulnerable to subversion. But in tandem with that, we also need to be leading abroad. We need to be working with those other democracies to not only learn from one another, but also to detect these operations together and to jointly punish countries that execute them. Because if England or the United Kingdom were to punish Russia for interfering in its elections, that might sting. But if Russia interferes in the United Kingdom's elections and then a coalition of democracies jointly imposes costs on Russia for doing so, that would hurt a whole lot more. And it would serve as a much more effective deterrent in terms of signaling to Russia that we're still invested in the democratic model, that we believe in the democratic model, and that we are going to defend the democratic model rather than just let our elections be open season for foreign subversion.
So you've recently written that one of the most effective ways to neutralize covert action is to expose it. Do you think we as an American public are sufficiently aware of Russia's, of the influence that Russia is exerting, and are we prepared to neutralize this threat? Do you think that, you know, in the 2020 election, Russia is ultimately going to achieve their goals?
So I think in the long term, we will absolutely have the means to neutralize or effectively neutralize this threat, again, by investing in ourselves at home and by leading abroad. In the short term, in the next 7 weeks, I think we're in a pretty precarious spot. I think many large swaths of this country do not believe that Russian interference exists. I think that there's so much chaos happening in our country right now that it's very difficult, for understandable reasons, to really focus on this threat and spread awareness about it. And even when the FBI or DHS have released public information about Russia's operation, as they should be doing, it's only been a blip in an otherwise crazy news cycle. And so I think awareness is low. I think vulnerability is high because of all of the dysfunction and chaos in our society right now. And I think that the next few months will be difficult ones for American democracy, but that shouldn't be a call to wave the white flag. American democracy in general, has never been the easy thing. Democracy takes hard work. It takes effort to maintain. And history, I will just say, does provide reassurance here, because democracies generations ago that were targets of these sorts of operations remain in many cases democracies today. American democracy, even though it's being interfered in by foreign actors, can still be a vibrant democracy 1, 2, 3 generations from now. It just falls on us as citizens to care enough to distinguish fact from fiction, to defend our own electoral processes, and to demand that our democracy be a sovereign state structure in which we're able to hold independent elections and then also punish those who would seek to undermine our efforts to do so. And if we do that, I believe we can and will have a democracy that not only persists, but thrives in this new digital world that we now live in.
David, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us on State of the World today. I want to encourage everyone in the audience, again, the link to purchase David's book through RJ Julia, a special signed copy, is in the chat. And also appearing in the chat, I want to encourage everybody, if you're not registered to vote, register to vote. Check your registration. Make sure you know where your polling place is if you plan on going to the polls. Or if you plan on getting your mail-in ballot, please have that in hand. Please make your voting plan. It's up to each one of us as citizens to be responsible citizens, and I want to encourage everyone to make sure you vote. David, thank you so much.
Thank you very much again for having me.
David, that was fantastic. Thank you again. Thank you to everyone who's joining us. I want to encourage everyone not only to register to vote, to buy David's signed copy of Rigged through the RJ Julia website, but to also visit the World Affairs Council YouTube channel at World Affairs Council of Connecticut. If you subscribe, you'll get a notification when this video is live, in addition to our future episodes as well. Until then, thank you again for joining us, and thank you so much, David, for being a part of such an important conversation and for your latest work.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Until next time.